Go. Welcome to another CEO Wisdom Pod. We have Dave Kline with us. He's training managers on a playbook for leading high performance team. He's an entrepreneur, writer, advisor, speaker, coach, has a community of 200K plus leaders, worked at Bridgewater for almost a decade as co-head of department, aka recruiting. Really a top guy there. He's been the owner and still is at Skill Scouter, and nowadays co-founder at MT Accelerators. So top performer right here. I'm gonna ask him a bunch of questions on how to build high performance team. I sort of gave up on hiring humans as of recently. I'm mostly hiring AIs, but let's see if Dave can revive that in me. So this podcast is brought to you by podfire.com. Podfire is my podcasting company. If you want to start, scale, or monetize a podcast, you can go to podfire.com. Podcasts are amazing lead gen funnels. You can make money with them through sponsors and Google AdSense paying you out. So really recommend starting and scaling your pod there, podfire.com. It's also brought to you by our friends at Neurohacker/Qualia. It's a supplement that I take on a daily basis as a busy entrepreneur for focus, energy. I crunch 15-hour days on a daily basis, almost. And I depend on that one to keep me alive. You can go to neurohacker.com/CEO wisdom. Dave, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Charles, thanks for having me on. What am I up to these days? Mostly we spend a lot of time with leaders from companies that are as small as 15 people to 150,000 plus, trying to help them avoid the mistakes that I made in 20 plus years leading teams.
And why did you dive into entrepreneurship? I mean, you had a pretty good job, right? Like we all read about the salaries at Bridgewater. Like, why get out of that and start your own company?
But the headline answer is personal sovereignty. Like at some point, being able to choose what I spend my time on, who I spend it with, and where I do it from, outweighed any additional financial reward of being at a hedge fund.
For those that don't know about Bridgewater, tell us a bit more why it's unique and tell us about Ray Dalio, which is a virtual mentor of mine, really top guy right there.
Well, I think the best way to get people's head into Bridgewater is to sort of start from like, well, what was the mission of that organization? I think most people would assume our mission was to generate outsized returns for, pension funds and sovereigns. But the mission that we had was to understand the world. And then our application of that mission was against, markets and how cash moved. And so this idea of to take really curious, different thinking people and say, like, could we map how every dollar or every piece of currency moved around the world and then use that information to make investments into a range of markets? So that's an important backdrop to then why you go get highly ambitious people who are willing to debate, strip away any desire to, couch things or sugarcoat things, but put really smart people in a room, have it fight it out, and hopefully we'll get to the right answer. And so it created a really idiosyncratic culture for macro investing. I think the other key part to it is that it was highly systematic, that the idea that you could see everything as a machine, right? Nothing more complicated than there's inputs going through a set of process, people, and design to produce an output. If the output's right, you keep doubling down on that bet. If the output's wrong, you diagnose why and then change those same set of things to try to get better outcomes. And so you put those two things together, right? These type A ambitious debaters into a highly systematic environment, and you get a pretty idiosyncratic culture that attracted a wide number of people, but probably repelled 10 times as many.
I've always wondered why type AA plus like myself would accept a job while they could have sovereignty over themselves and uncap themselves, have a salary that is as good as their imagination is, right? Do you have an answer to that one?
I think on a risk-adjusted basis, if you can get yourself into the top echelons of a Bridgewater, of an Amazon, of a Google, you probably accelerate some parts of what other people would prioritize, right? They might prioritize the impact and scale or power while still achieving the same financial reward. I think for others, like me, right? Like my seasons sort of changed. I went from wanting that comfort and that perceived, uh, sort of like perceived safety of being inside of an existing organization, only to then realize that sovereignty had re-ranked on my list. The surprise for me on the other side of that is realizing that when you have hundreds of customers and one fires you, it barely changes your business. When you have one employer and they fire you, it changes your entire life.
Right. I guess yeah, I always had different objectives as well. I want to go like at least Elon big, like probably be a trillionaire. That I don't feel like being hired. I think being hired would greatly slow that. Although there's much unrealism behind that goal. Now I think maybe fractional roles are more popular nowadays. Maybe I'd accept a very part-time job, like 2 hours, I don't know, paid at least 5 to 10K a week or something like that at some
Mhm.
company, which would resemble very much my coaching service. Have you seen like a growth in fractional roles nowadays and the importance they're taking this market?
I think there's quite a big growth in fractional roles. Um, a question to sort of flip back to you. So how are you going to get to a trillion? How are you going to be a trillionaire with no employees?
AGI, which is also long shots. I have five big goals I want to achieve in the next couple of decades. First, to start a school. That one, I don't think I'll make much money with it, but I'll definitely brush a chip off my shoulder. Start a bank, which is ambitious and will make money. AGI, which I think will be accomplished by other folks than myself, so I might be a collaborator there. Neuralink that AGI with my brain. So that's where the $1 trillion comes from. When you can have all the insights in the world and when you can literally see the money moving in real time, probably like Ray's vision, but like 1,000x telescoped. And yeah, finally not die. So if you don't die, another question could be, yeah, will capitalism will be revolutionized and will $1 trillion even mean anything at this point? So if you compile AGI, Neuralink, and not dying and having your own bank, yeah, you probably have like at least 85% chances of making it. But what are your thoughts on that?
85 seems wildly optimistic.
Could be.
Well,
Why?
I'm just saying you have to stack up the probabilities on all those things. Like you're not alone in AGI. If AGI is available to you, it's available to everyone. If Neuralink's available to you, it's available to everyone. So now you're betting that there's something additional that you're layering in that makes each one of those bets a pretty high probability to get to the sum total of those bets being 85%.
Yeah, I don't think
I
it'll
think
be available to everyone though. Like I mean, this M3 computer that I'm at is more GPU than probably, yeah, 95% of computers in this planet, and it's not accessible to most because of the price, for example. Um,
Mhm.
I think UBI might be a thing. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Like once AGI is a thing, which might disrupt the full thing. I think also this goal is like gives me serotonin and dopamine, um, trillionaire, like it gives me testosterone as well as a man. So it's something to chase. It's something that's simple enough for my brain to understand that I need to get my ass to work smart, work long, work hard. Um, but yeah, indeed, it's a bit broad. But what's your take on like predictions and goals? Like, should they have numbers? Should they be precise? Should I research the crap out of all of them? And if so, how should I, yeah, back this up with quote unquote numbers and research and stats?
It's funny. I find that the teams that set the best goals or individuals who set the best goals, they set them in a way that actually motivates them. So the fact that you're motivated by a highly, unlikely, perhaps unattainable goal, if that gets you out of bed and gets you driven, and like you said, has you showing up every day, um, you have a much higher probability of achieving it than other people who don't. And B, the fact that it resonates for you. Like I just published one of our playbooks and I was talking about the OKRs in there briefly. And a lot of people will say like, oh, OKR, the objective should be a moonshot. And I'm like, the moonshots, I'm opposite of you. Like it doesn't motivate me to have something that I deem to be unattainable. So for me, my objectives tend to be ambitious, but I want to see that I'm making progress. I want to see that I can stack a few bricks, et cetera. So I think it really depends on who they're designed to motivate.
Right. And it's very much the moonshot philosophy behind this goal of mine, but I've also faced that lack of motivation from that slow improvement. But I also know that
Mhm.
just like you're in this season of your life right now, which is pursuing entrepreneurship, seasons may come abruptly and suddenly, right? And
Yeah.
uh Ray probably made his first 10 million on a whim. And it was like, whoa, okay, that just happened. I think it was at the right place at the right time. I think the stock market was, yeah, a great invention, still is. It has humongous leverage. Do you feel that there's other technologies, quote unquote, that have more leverage than the stock market for people that are smart and making and good at making predictions? Because we had Berkshire Hathaway, we had Bridgewater. I mean, these funds, these hedge funds, quote unquote, just hedge on the fact that the founder is really smart. They're good at making research. They have an intellectual edge. Plus, they can borrow 10 million from the bank and invest that and make 100 million to a billion. Do you feel that there's a better technology to make that much money in that short amount of time nowadays?
I mean, I think that you have multiple vehicles. I don't know if one is better than the other, but I think obviously software, code, AI have all proven to be highly leveraged vehicles, right? Like I think if we rewound the clock to even 10 years ago, if you said there were companies that had a revenue that was $1 million an employee, they would have been a massive outlier. Now I think it becomes automation, AI, outsourcing, et cetera. You put those together in combinations where that's increasingly common. So I think you have code, I think you have globalization. I think the other thing is you have this reach with social media, with YouTube, like with the internet. The fact that when we started teaching our training program, my initial thought was I would just jump into one of the universities nearby. I'm within 30 miles of 3 Ivy League institutions. Like, oh, I'll go teach management. That would be a great platform. And the folks at Maven were like, well, why would you do that? Like, yeah, you can impact 50 or 60 like privileged kids nearby. Or you could literally market what you do to 5 billion people who are connected to the internet. And so you start to see the scope and the scale of that thing. And so I think whether you want to call it attention or audience, et cetera, that is the other place where a single person in an office can go get a ton of leverage in a way that wasn't available 25, 30 years ago when Ray started.
Right. I think Bridgewater had like one of the highest profit per head ratio ever. How did you select these employees from the get-go? I mean, the pool started broad, most probably some Ivy League in there, some questionnaires, some personality tests. But in the
Mhm.
end, when I would recruit employees, probably 5% were top performers and superstars. In your case, it would probably be way higher than that. So how do you systematize the selection of a Super Bowl?
Well, I think the answer is it ends not being possible in the following way that even if you put 1,500 amazing stars by the general population's perspective, they're still going to end up in a distribution. And so the stars of the stars are going to outshine the other 90% of the population more so. So I think you see that happen. I think the other challenge, if you go to like the Bridgewater history, and it might be instructive for other companies, which is you can amass talent, but it has to match your growth ambitions. And so for a lot of my time, Bridgewater, like our main fund was capped and we weren't necessarily opening up new strategies. And so you had a huge amount of type A ambitious talent pursuing an increasingly small set of interesting challenges and opportunities. You can see that work. Like my wife, who I run the business with, worked at Google during a massive growth spike, and it worked much better there, right? You could amass talent, asking people to do jobs that might have been multiple levels beneath them because the growth rate was so massive and so high that there was still more gaps to fill than people to fill them. And so I think in that case, you might be able to grab, retain, and motivate a higher percentage of stars.
So there's still a structure going on, but is it like, oh, we've invested in Josh for 2 years now, he hasn't yielded anything, and all of a sudden he just made a decision that stemmed from his 2 years with us that will generate tens of millions, and all of a sudden 2 years being in, Josh has some kind of ROI?
I mean, the way that we were structured wouldn't have really worked that way. Like we were compounding into like decades long, sort of almost like code base would be the way you think of it, like collective knowledge that had built up over time. So it'd be pretty rare for somebody to come up with like a singular sort of bet or trade. It would be much more um, a new innovation or way to see the world that would then fold into that sort of hive mind. So I don't think it would be that. It was much more sort of the hit rate of the quality of ideas over time and how much those contributions were having. So, um, but again, it most of it, if you said like, well, why was there turnover? It would have been the other side. It would have been people not necessarily comfortable with uh, operating in the way that we operated, highly transparent, truth to power, pushing each other. Or the alternative would be they felt because of that sort of decades long compounding of knowledge, they felt too diffuse in their impact and would go out into the world to go do something else. Like multiple people who we worked with who were, you would have said, average in terms of the performance sort of distribution, went on to start unicorns, And so,
Interesting. And yeah, I
yeah.
guess how much they're a positive influence to their peers. How do you mathematically measure that? And there's the chaos theory in an organization. I guess it becomes quite hard at some point to calculate how much influence they have in the circle that is the team.
I think the team is the worst part that we struggle. Sorry, that's like the hardest part for us to measure because of so many. Like, how do you isolate all the variables that go into a team? Is it poorly constructed? Is it poorly targeted? Is it poorly motivated? So a lot of our attention went much more to like the individuals. Like if you put it into a sports team analogy, it was funny. I was just reading about Jurgen Klopp, because hopefully they're going to trick him into coming to manage the US, which seems like a 1% chance, but it would be pretty sweet if it happened. And he was saying, look, you only get to control two things, like the quality of the athletes and how well they train. Nothing, I don't get to control anything else. And so if you put that in the same context, right? Like it's pretty hard for us to control all those different variables on how the team comes together. But the thinking is, can you get the most talented athletes? And then can you sort of organize them so that they cooperate in a high functioning system? And that was the idea of the culture. So you have a clearly articulated, codified culture that attracts the right people, and then you do your best to bring in the highest caliber talent with the highest trajectory. I think there's going to be work that we'll figure out with teams through time. Maybe to your point on AGI, as we can all of a sudden get through higher volumes of data, collect more observations, and see that. But I have not. We didn't come across very much that said like do these 7 things and teams will be great. Like even I think Google probably did one of the biggest research projects on that, and even that's not terribly instructive.
Right. And Google are not in their best days nowadays. It seems that their program had a bigger impact in 2010-ish when Larry and Sergey was there. If we take soccer teams slash football teams, it's probably my least favorite sport, but it's the sports with the most available data because there's the most fans. So I
Mm-hmm.
studied football teams extensively. And if we keep it really simple, let's say that you're forward, right? Like you're put up with two other peers. And let's say that you're Ronaldo, and yeah, you're on the left. Well, you need to have a good chemistry with the two other players. They need to be similar to you, just like in Bridgewater. You wouldn't put like a high performer with a low performer. I don't think you guys ever accept low performers ever. I think you only go for A players. That's the basis. But there's also this chemistry thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I get along with pretty much a bunch of people. I say everything that's on my mind, so that's very much aligned with Bridgewater. But some people don't get along with that thing, and they're resistant, right? So like, what is that thing that is chemistry, and how do you quantify it, and when is it a good time to switch a very high performer? Let's say that you have a Ronaldo in your team and he's not getting along with others. When's the right time to move that person to another department at Bridgewater?
Yesterday. No. Well, look, I would say if you abstract it slightly from Bridgewater, I don't think that there is a universal kind of molecular elements of chemistry, I think it varies by organization. So within Bridgewater, part of part of that chemistry, to your point, was this ability for people to simultaneously be highly assertive, right? I'm an independent thinker. I have a point of view of how things work in the world, et cetera, combined and not on a spectrum, but like at the same time, a duality with being radically open-minded and curious about what they're missing. And so that, to some degree, if you think about the chemistry of that bond, it's like, oh, everybody's got strong opinions loosely held. And everyone's willing to be curious at times to improve their opinion and vice versa. That was, I think, the sort of the foundational behavior that became whether or not people were sort of organ rejected or accepted into that organization. I work with a totally different company that is in the AI space, automation, they're global. I would have said like their nuclear element is ownership. Like they've cascaded this idea of ownership down to the frontline managers. They have P&Ls. They're like margin responsible. They get equity. Like it is a lot of companies say they want people to be owners. These guys make everybody owners from day one. And so it's the same sort of thing because owner is both like it's like a title and a mentality. And so there's people who come in who will like point to problems and whine about them versus like grab onto them the way an owner would and just solve them whether they're their problem or not. And it's the same sort of, to me, that's the nuclear element of their chemistry that allows people to be accepted or rejected. So I think probably the key thing is like, well, what is the nuclear element? What's the non-negotiable behavior of the organization that you've created against the mission that was designed to achieve?
You spent a decade with Ray Dalio. What did you learn from him that we don't know about in the books?
I can't, I have to admit, I haven't memorized like the 500 pages of books. I thought the one thing that was really interesting, and I've now seen it in other successful founders, and I've seen a few others write about it. He had a tremendous ability to traverse from very high strategic macro concepts into the details. But what was different about it, so this is probably the part that's not in the book, most people would look at that and say, like, oh, that's micromanagement. But what it was, at least how I experienced it, was going to the detail to test whether the strategy and the culture were correct and thriving or incorrect and degrading. And so it wasn't like I really want to come in there and micromanage this little piece of data, but that little data is product of this giant machine above. And so he would constantly traverse down to test something and go back up and adjust and traverse down and test something. And I think I've heard a couple interviews with Elon talking in a very similar way of like why he wants small teams, why he wants to talk to the developers, not the managers of managers, et cetera. I think the CEO of Nvidia has 50 something direct reports for a similar set of reasons. So anyways, I thought that seeing that firsthand was pretty interesting and quite a superpower if you can do it well.
I love your content on LinkedIn and Twitter. What is your formula to come up with great content?
I'm sure you'd love to hear that I have an amazing sort of content system, but mostly, I look back at all the stuff I screwed up and try to write notes to myself about how to avoid it. And B, I get tons of inspiration from the people that we train and coach. Like they are on the front lines, running into problems every day. And, what are the ways that I would deal with that situation if I were in their shoes? I would say those are the two primary points of inspiration.
As a human first person, how would you merge AIs of now and potential AGIs of the future with top A plus humans?
Well, I think we're already doing it. Again, the thing that I would be having any leader who is working with me, you have to start using it. Like I don't think you can get very far sort of watching. And I think you have to get through um, what I would call like the early false negative rejection. It's like someone's like, I'm going to go to ChatGPT and use it to lead my team. And then I'm going to ask it a couple really crappy prompts. And the prompts are simultaneously magic because you're like, holy cow, that's actually half good. And then you read it a second time and realize, but it's not as good as it would have been if you had a chief of staff who had worked for you for 5 years and you'd given them the same assignment and you'd done 5 revisions and gotten to a final product. But that's like an unfair comparison. The fair comparison is to say, how long would it have taken me to get that first draft back from my freelancer? And would it have been as good or worse than this? And usually it's actually better and it's instantaneous. And so you start there. Now, where does this go? Like, can it turn into, will it replace me coaching people? Probably, at least for a huge subset of people. Could it also supplement me? Like, a lot of times people are asking me for advice and I'm telling them the same things. I've written 300,000 words about leading and managing teams. I've run into a bunch of stuff. I don't always remember what I've written. I don't always remember the stuff. Well, AGI has a pretty damn good memory, and can then take it and reapply and abstract it and offer up new options. It could also look at another subset of things like, I've read hundreds of books. I don't remember the hundreds of books, but it sure does. And so I just think that there's a world where this increasingly, for some of us, it'll become the second brain that makes us better. In some cases, you might split it, and I might have offerings that are tuned by me, but mostly AI driven, and people have to pay access for the real me. You can imagine a number of ways to go with that.
Right. Last but not least, I'm your LinkedIn. That stat here. So how does it feel to generate 385 million in 1 year at Moody's?
It was a hell of a year, man. I mean, to be fair, it's not like I walked in one day and went from 0 to 385. That's a business that's been built through time. But I think I was 30, so to be 30 years old and sort of have a team of 45, 50 people responsible for that kind of number it was a pretty huge responsibility. And I don't know, in hindsight, it feels surreal, but based on the beginning of our conversation, that's like 0.1% of where you're headed. So
That's great. Thanks for coming on, Dave. Where can people find out more about you?
Like you said, I'm on Twitter at Dkline II. I'm on LinkedIn at Dave Kline. I've got a newsletter, the management playbook, mgmt.beehive.com. But it's just my wife and I running this business. So reach out. We're here.